At 5:12 on a Saturday morning, Teresa Reed stepped out of the distribution center and felt the cold Milwaukee air settle against her face. The sky was still black. Her shoulders ached from counting cartons beneath fluorescent lights, and the inside of her right wrist carried a faint red line from the scanner strap. She had volunteered for the extra shift 3 days earlier. Martin Cole, her 56-year-old supervisor, had barely finished asking before Teresa said yes. She always said yes. The extra hours would appear on her next paycheck. But Teresa already knew where the money would go. A furniture store payment, a home goods card, the monthly charge for a storage unit 6 miles away. She had assigned every future dollar before earning it. When Teresa reached her small house, the neighborhood was silent. She left her shoes by the door and carried the mail into the dining room. The table was polished and beautiful. 6 upholstered chairs surrounded it, although no more than 2 people had ever sat there at once. Teresa placed a store envelope on the table and opened it. The payment due was much larger than she expected. She read the statement once, then again. A promotional period connected to the dining room furniture had ended before the remaining balance was paid. The terms had always been printed on the statements, but Teresa had looked only at the minimum amount due. Now interest had been added according to the agreement, and the balance felt as if it had moved backward while she was working forward. She lowered herself into one of the chairs. The shift she had just finished would not cover the new amount. For several minutes, Teresa stared at the table. She remembered choosing it because the salesperson said it made the room look complete. She remembered imagining quiet dinners with adult friends, linen napkins, candles, and conversations that lasted long after the plates were cleared. None of that had happened. Most evenings, Teresa ate from a bowl while standing beside the kitchen counter. The dining room existed to be dusted, protected, and paid for. That morning, a thought arrived with such clarity that it frightened her. She had just spent an entire night working to pay for a room she never used. Teresa was 52. She had worked at the distribution center for 14 years, most of them on the night shift. She was dependable, careful, and fast without being careless. New adult employees were often sent to watch her because she knew how to catch inventory errors before they became expensive problems. People at work assumed Teresa accepted overtime because she was ambitious. The truth was less flattering. Teresa needed the additional income to maintain the evidence that her life was progressing. The evidence filled her house. There was a stand mixer in the kitchen that had been used twice, a juicer behind it that had never been used, and a set of copper-colored pans, too delicate for the meals Teresa actually cooked. The living room held a cream sofa she covered with a throw because she feared staining it. Beside the sofa stood an accent chair, selected for its appearance rather than comfort. No one chose to sit in it. The second bedroom contained an exercise bike, unopened storage baskets, craft supplies, extra lamps, and boxes of seasonal decorations. Teresa had bought each item for a reason. The exercise bike belonged to the energetic woman she intended to become. The craft supplies belonged to the creative woman she expected to discover. The serving dishes belonged to the generous host she was always preparing to be. Teresa did not think of herself as reckless. She compared prices. She waited for sales. She used coupons and promotional offers. She could explain why almost every purchase had seemed sensible on the day she made it. Teresa had purchased the house at 38 after years of renting small apartments. Signing the papers had felt like crossing an invisible line between surviving and becoming established. She had arrived with a bed, a worn sofa, 4 plates, and a folding kitchen table. The rooms echoed, and for a while she enjoyed the emptiness. Then she began interpreting every empty wall as unfinished work. An adult co-worker recommended a furniture outlet. A television program convinced her that a dining room needed a focal point. Catalogues showed bedrooms layered with blankets and decorative pillows. Teresa did not purchase everything at once. She built the burden patiently, one reasonable decision at a time. Whenever she paid off an item, she felt entitled to replace the payment with another. A cleared balance did not create margin, it created permission. Over 14 years, the house filled, while Teresa's sense of arrival kept moving farther away. The cruelest part was that she rarely felt extravagant. She felt responsible. She was improving an asset, preparing for visitors, and buying durable things instead of wasting money on temporary pleasure. Yet durable objects could create temporary pleasure too. The excitement faded, while the payment remained. What she could not explain was why so many sensible purchases had left her with so little room to breathe. If stories about ordinary women rebuilding their financial lives help you feel less alone, you are welcome to subscribe. Teresa's turning point did not begin with a fortune or a perfect plan. It began at a table she was still paying for. She slept for 4 restless hours. When she woke, the statement was still open beside her hand. Teresa carried it into the kitchen and retrieved the other bills from a drawer. She normally kept them separated by company, but that afternoon she arranged them by room. The dining set and cabinet belonged to the dining room. The sofa, accent chair, rug and media console belonged to the living room. The mixer, pans, juicer and coffee machine belonged to the kitchen. The exercise bike and craft store balance belonged to the second bedroom. Then she opened her banking application and added the monthly payments. At first, she thought the total had to be wrong. She entered the numbers again. The result barely changed. Several days of her take-home pay each month were committed to objects inside the house. That total did not include the mortgage, utilities, insurance, groceries, transportation, or the storage unit. It represented only the continuing cost of things she had already brought home. Teresa went one step further. She divided her average take-home pay by the hours she normally worked and estimated how much working time each monthly payment represented. She knew the calculation was imperfect. Taxes, benefits, and changing overtime made the relationship more complicated than a clean equation. She was not trying to create a universal formula. She wanted a language strong enough to interrupt her habits. The dining room required most of one extra shift that month. The living room accounts required another. The storage unit consumed hours merely to keep forgotten possessions out of sight. Teresa wrote those hours beside the balances. The numbers changed the atmosphere of the house. The sofa was no longer only a sofa. It was a series of nights beneath warehouse lights. The sealed appliance in the pantry was a morning when she had driven home too tired to notice the sunrise. The unopened decorations were part of a Saturday she had declined an invitation from Evelyn because she said she needed the overtime. Teresa did not blame every difficult shift on shopping. Her regular income supported her home and her independence. Work had value beyond what it purchased. But the exercise forced her to distinguish between labor that sustained her life and labor already promised to things that contributed almost nothing to it. Teresa walked from room to room with a pad of small yellow labels. On each object with a remaining balance, she wrote the name of the account and the amount still owed. She did not write the original price. That money was gone. She wrote what the object continued to demand from her future. The dining table received the first label. The sofa received another. By evening, the house looked as if it were holding a silent auction in which Teresa was the only bidder, and her time was the currency. She stood in the second bedroom and counted 11 labels. Some balances were small, others were not. Together, they changed the meaning of the room. What had once looked like abundance now looked like unfinished obligations. Teresa sat on a box of unused storage baskets and tried to remember the last Saturday she had not worked, cleaned, shopped, or worried about money. She could not. On Monday night, Carmen Alvarez found Teresa in the break room, studying a printed statement. Carmen was 49 and worked in receiving. She wore bright earrings beneath her safety headset and could turn an ordinary cup of vending machine coffee into a reason to laugh. "Planning something?" Carmen asked. Teresa folded the paper too quickly. "Trying to understand something I should have understood a long time ago." Carmen waited without pushing. Teresa finally told her about the promotional balance and the labels around the house. She expected Carmen to make a joke. Instead, Carmen set down her coffee. "How many labels?" 32. Carmen's eyes widened. 32 things you still owe money on? 32 things I could identify. Saying it aloud made Teresa feel exposed, yet the embarrassment carried a strange relief. The problem was no longer a fog. It had a number, a shape, and a physical location. After work, Teresa photographed the exercise bike, the accent chair, and several boxed appliances. She listed them for sale, convinced that a weekend of determined effort could reverse years of spending. The messages came quickly, but the offers did not resemble the prices she had paid. One person offered less than a quarter of the exercise bike's original cost. Another wanted the chair delivered across town for almost nothing. The unopened juicer attracted no serious interest at all. Teresa grew angry at the buyers before recognizing that they were not responsible for her decisions. Used objects were worth what someone was willing to pay, not what she needed them to be worth. For 2 days, she considered keeping everything rather than accepting the loss. The thought sounded reasonable. If she sold the exercise bike cheaply, she would make the purchase even more wasteful. Then Evelyn Brooks, Teresa's 67-year-old neighbor, came over to return a baking dish. Evelyn noticed the yellow label on the dining table. "Is that a reminder?" she asked. "More like a confession." Teresa explained what she had done. Evelyn listened, then ran one hand across the polished wood. "Keeping something doesn't bring the money back," she said. "But you don't have to empty the house in a panic either. Decide what deserves space in the life you have now." That sentence changed Teresa's approach. She stopped treating the house like a pile of emergency cash. She selected only a few objects to sell, accepted reasonable offers, and directed the modest proceeds toward one balance. She donated items that were useful but unlikely to sell. Some things remained while she decided whether they served her actual life. The essential change was less dramatic and more difficult. Teresa stopped adding new labels. She removed stored payment information from shopping websites. She placed store cards in an envelope rather than carrying them. She unsubscribed from messages that made every weekend sound like her last chance to save money. Then she studied the statements themselves. For years, Teresa had treated the minimum payment as the amount the company expected her to pay. Now she read the repayment information printed on the bill. She saw that making only minimum payments could keep a balance alive for years and increase the total interest paid. She also learned that promotional financing was not free money or permission to ignore a purchase. Its conditions and deadline mattered. The lesson was not that every person should follow the same payoff method. Teresa's income, obligations, and agreements were her own. But she could no longer pretend that the smallest required payment was a plan for becoming free of the balance. She built a simple system around her paydays. Housing, utilities, food, transportation, and required payments came first. She kept a small monthly buffer because a plan with no room for ordinary surprises would send her straight back to credit. Everything remaining was assigned deliberately, with an additional amount sent toward the balance costing her the most. The first month felt slow. The labels remained visible. The balances did not collapse. Teresa still worked 2 extra shifts because she had already committed to them. What changed was that she knew where the money went. At the end of the month, the balance on one kitchen appliance reached 0. Teresa removed its label and stood there holding the little yellow square between her fingers. The appliance itself had not changed. Her relationship to it had. She decided to keep it, only if she used it. That weekend, she made soup with it and invited Evelyn to share lunch. It was not an impressive meal. It was the first time the purchase participated in Teresa's real life. If you looked around your own home, which object would represent the most time, money, or attention? You do not need to answer publicly. Teresa simply needed to ask the question honestly. Progress continued in uneven steps. 1 month, over time, allowed Teresa to pay more. The next month, higher utility costs reduced the amount. She stopped interpreting every slower month as failure. The system was designed for her actual life, not for a perfect life that existed only on paper. Carmen watched with interest. At first, she teased Teresa about the labels, calling them tiny supervisors. Then, during a meal break, Carmen showed Teresa an advertisement for a complete kitchen update offered through a store promotion. "Look at those cabinets," Carmen said, "and they say there are no payments for the first few months. You could finally redo your kitchen." Teresa studied the photograph. The kitchen was white, bright, and empty of every inconvenient sign that someone cooked there. For a moment, she imagined herself inside it. New counters, matching fixtures, colleagues admiring the result. The old excitement returned so quickly that Teresa almost laughed. She could already hear the arguments forming in her mind. The cabinets were dated. The promotion would not last. Improving the house might increase its value. She worked hard and deserved something beautiful. Then she pictured a yellow label on every cabinet door. "I don't need a new kitchen," she said. "I need to use the one I have without owing money for the next one." Carmen looked disappointed. "I thought you loved home projects." "I love believing the next project would make me feel finished." The conversation stayed with Teresa through the night. She realized that shopping had not been only about possessions. It had allowed her to rehearse a future identity without risking the effort of living it. Buying serving dishes felt easier than inviting someone to dinner. Buying exercise equipment felt easier than creating a routine. Buying craft supplies felt easier than tolerating the awkwardness of being a beginner. The objects had promised transformation without requiring vulnerability. Teresa went home and removed the yellow label from the craft supplies, not because the balance was paid, but because she made a decision. She kept one small set of materials and gave the rest to a local adult community art group. On her next free afternoon, she attended a beginner session there. Every participant was an adult. Teresa's work was uneven, and she enjoyed herself anyway. That was when the house began to change in a way no shopping trip had accomplished. The second bedroom slowly became usable. Teresa did not redesign it. She cleared a desk, moved one comfortable chair beside the window, and left open space where boxes had been. The room stopped representing all the women she might become and started supporting the woman she already was. At work, however, another pattern remained. Martin continued posting extra shifts, and Teresa continued feeling that familiar pull. Even when she did not need every shift for the current plan, saying no felt irresponsible. Overtime had become both a financial tool and a form of penance. If she worked hard enough, perhaps she could forgive herself for the purchases. The distribution center rewarded availability quietly. The most dependable employees were asked first, then expected first. Teresa had spent years building an identity around being the person who solved a schedule problem before it became Martin's problem. When she began declining occasional shifts, she worried that her regular hours would somehow become less secure, or that colleagues would question her commitment. She reviewed her workplace information and found no promise that constant voluntary overtime was required for her role. Still, facts did not immediately erase the fear of disappointing someone. Carmen noticed Teresa studying the overtime sheet without writing her name. "You know they can ask someone else," Carmen said. "Someone else might need the hours." then letting them. Take the shift isn't selfish. Teresa realized she had been treating every open shift as a personal debt. The warehouse had survived before she arrived and would operate after she went home. Being reliable did not require being permanently available. One Thursday, Martin approached her before the end of the shift. "I need someone experienced Saturday," he said. "Can I put you down?" Teresa thought of the dining room balance. It was close to being paid, and one more shift would finish it sooner. She also thought of the adult art session she had planned to attend, and the groceries already purchased for a Sunday meal with Carmen and Evelyn. "Not this Saturday," she said. Martin paused. Teresa had made herself so consistently available that her refusal sounded like a scheduling error. "Everything okay?" "Everything is getting better. I can take one extra shift next month, but I won't be available every weekend anymore." Martin frowned at the staffing sheet, then nodded. "Let me know which one you can take." That was all. Teresa had expected resistance, judgment, or a lecture about commitment. Instead, Martin adjusted the schedule. The boundary felt enormous to her and ordinary to everyone else. On Saturday morning, Teresa woke without an alarm. Sunlight reached the foot of her bed. For several seconds, she felt guilty for not being at work. Then she remembered that rest was not evidence of irresponsibility. She made coffee and carried it to the dining table. The yellow label was still there. Teresa opened her banking application and made the final planned payment on the dining room balance. She did not use money needed for essentials, and she did not empty her small buffer for the satisfaction of reaching zero a few days earlier. She paid the amount the plan allowed. When the transaction was confirmed, she peeled the label from the table. The wood beneath it was slightly lighter than the surrounding surface. Teresa laughed, then unexpectedly cried. Not because a table had been paid off, but because the room no longer owned future Saturdays. The following evening, Carmen and Evelyn arrived carrying simple dishes. All three women were adults with their own complicated histories around work, money, and what a respectable life was supposed to look like. Carmen stopped in the dining room doorway. "You're actually using it." "That was the expensive idea," Teresa said. "I thought the table was for a different version of my life. And now it's for dinner." They ate soup, bread, and salad from dishes Teresa already owned. No place setting matched perfectly. One serving bowl had a small chip near the rim. The room looked more alive than it had when everything was untouched. During the meal, Carmen admitted that she had been considering the kitchen promotion because she was tired of her own apartment and wanted a dramatic change. Teresa did not tell her what to do. She described what the labels had shown her and suggested only that Carmen read the entire agreement before making a decision. Evelyn raised her glass of water. "To rooms that earn their place." The three women laughed, but Teresa understood the deeper meaning. Over the next several months, more labels disappeared. Not all of them. Teresa still owed money on the sofa and one kitchen account. She continued making steady payments while maintaining room in the budget for ordinary life. The storage unit became the next decision. When Teresa opened it after months away, she found duplicate lamps, boxes of decorations, a folding table, old linens, and several purchases she had forgotten completely. None of them were protecting her. They required a monthly fee simply to remain unseen. She spent 3 weekends sorting the contents. Evelyn helped on the first. Carmen joined on the second. Every person involved was an adult, and no one treated the process like an entertaining purge. They worked slowly, deciding what was useful, what could be donated, what could be sold for a modest amount, and what had reached the end of its use. Near the back of the unit, Teresa found 4 unopened boxes from the year she had first moved into the house. Inside were framed prints, table linens, decorative glassware, and a set of candle holders. She had paid to move them, paid to store them, and occasionally considered buying replacements because she had forgotten they existed. For a few minutes, Teresa wanted to carry everything home, Finding the boxes felt like discovering property she was supposed to protect. Evelyn asked one question: where would these live? Teresa could not name a place without displacing something she already used. She kept one framed print that still gave her pleasure. The remaining objects went to an adult-run community resale program. Teresa received no dramatic check and no emotional reward for maximizing their value. She received an empty section of concrete floor and the knowledge that she would not pay another month to preserve indecision. On the final weekend, the manager rolled down the unit door while Teresa stood outside with the lock in her palm. The cancellation required one more form and one final payment. Freedom did not arrive with music or applause. It arrived as a recurring charge that would not appear next month. Closing the unit did not erase Teresa's debt. It created a permanent monthly margin. She directed most of that amount toward her remaining balances and kept a smaller portion for future household expenses. For the first time, the plan addressed not only yesterday's purchases, but tomorrow's predictable needs. Teresa also opened the retirement statement she had avoided. The numbers did not tell her that everything would be fine, and the story did not transform one decision into a guaranteed future. They gave her a starting point. She reviewed the workplace information available to her and began making a contribution she could sustain without pretending it would solve every concern. Her financial life remained ordinary. That was precisely what made the changes matter. There was no inheritance, sudden promotion, or hidden valuable inside a box. The old exercise bike did not sell for a miraculous price. The house did not become a source of effortless income. Teresa continued earning each paycheck beneath the same warehouse lights. But the paycheck began to behave differently. Less of it vanished into minimum payments, less of it paid to store forgotten objects. Less of it was assigned to a future identity she could supposedly purchase. More of it remained available for choices. Teresa created 3 simple destinations for that growing margin. One portion accelerated the remaining revolving balance. One portion accumulated for predictable household needs, because appliances and maintenance would eventually require money even in a less cluttered home. The last portion supported her gradual retirement preparation. The amounts changed from month to month. Teresa did not divide them with artificial perfection, and she did not pretend that modest contributions guaranteed a comfortable future. The value of the system was that each dollar had a purpose before advertising. Fatigue or embarrassment could assign one for her. When a pair of work shoes wore out, Teresa replaced them without calling the purchase a failure. When Carmen invited her to a modest restaurant after a difficult shift, Teresa checked the plan and went. Simplicity was not a contest to spend the least possible amount. It was the removal of spending that demanded more from her life than it returned. One Saturday, nearly a year after the first statement arrived, Martin posted an overtime request. Teresa checked her plan before responding. She accepted one shift because it supported a goal she had chosen. She declined the second because Evelyn had invited her to an adult art exhibition and Teresa wanted to go. The difference was invisible on the staffing sheet. To Teresa, it was the difference between being driven by obligations and using work deliberately. That afternoon, she walked through the house with the remaining labels in her hand. The rooms were not empty. The sofa remained, now without its protective cover. Teresa sat on it regularly. The stand mixer remained because she had learned 3 recipes she enjoyed making. The accent chair was gone, replaced by nothing at all. The open space looked better than the chair ever had. The second bedroom held a desk, art materials she actually used, and one lamp. The dining room held the same table, but it no longer felt like a museum exhibit. There were faint water rings on the surface and a tiny mark where Carmen had dropped a serving spoon. Teresa liked both. She had once believed a well-furnished house would prove that her hard work had created a successful life. Now she understood that ownership without margin could become another form of dependence. The objects had not forced her to buy them. The stores had not promised that every purchase would improve her life forever. Teresa had participated in the cycle because buying something created a brief feeling of movement. The important discovery was not whom to blame. It was that she could stop. At 52, Teresa did not need to erase every mistake before building a different future. She needed to make the next decision with her eyes open. She learned that money already spent could not be recovered by keeping an unused object forever. She learned that a minimum payment was an obligation, not necessarily a strategy. She learned that promotional language mattered less than the full agreement. Most of all, she learned that every financial commitment also made a claim on her time. Teresa still worked hard. She simply stopped treating every available hour as something her past purchases were entitled to take. On the anniversary of the morning she opened that first statement, Teresa sat at the dining table with coffee and reviewed her accounts. 2 revolving balances had reached 0. 1 remained and was moving downward. Her small household fund could cover ordinary replacements without immediately reaching for a card. Her retirement preparation had begun, modestly and consistently. There were no dramatic numbers written across the page. There was something Teresa valued more, evidence that the direction had changed. She removed the final yellow label from the kitchen cabinet and placed it beside the others in a small envelope. She kept them not as trophies, but as reminders of the moment her house became honest. Then she called Carmen and Evelyn to confirm dinner. Before they arrived, Teresa did not rush to make the rooms look untouched. She opened the curtains, used the good dishes, and left her art project on the desk. The house showed signs of a life being lived. For years, Teresa had worked to pay for things she never used. Now she worked to support a life she actively chose. She had not become wealthy overnight. She had become harder to trap. Thank you for spending this time with Teresa. If her story stayed with you, the next video on your screen follows another ordinary woman who discovers that financial freedom can begin with one honest decision. Subscribe if you want more original stories about women rebuilding security, dignity, and choice, one realistic step at a time.